All right. Now, Ithala, a development finance agency, partly owned, and I want to say that again. Hold on. Let's just go back on this. It's a development finance agency. It's not meant to be a bank, right? And it's partly owned by the KwaZulu-Natal government. Says it will be filing for an urgent interdict to contest the repayment administrator's orders. Now, this comes after the South African Reserve Bank's Prudential Authority filed a court application to liquidate Ithala. Ithala has been operating without a full banking license under an exemption that expired then in December 2023. The KZN government says it has reached out to the finance minister seeking a temporary solution that would allow depositors to, or rather deposits to another bank until a permanent framework is established for Ithala. Frontline Group CEO Dr. Jason Musyoka joins us for this conversation. I have so many questions, but why is it that only now we're trying to find a solution for the interim? Wasn't Ithala itself operating under an interim solution anyway?
No, and thanks so much, Rabile, for having me. So I think that perhaps just a very brief context is always necessary. The Ithala Bank has been, it started off as, a finance development corporation, and then it became Ithala Bank, but it has been operating as a development finance institution. I think that needs to be clarified. And what that really means is that it is not a typical bank. It's sort of a microfinance. It gets more involved in the development space more than typical commercial banks do. But given that there are several conditions that the South African Reserve Bank requires for a bank to function, there are several types of banks. You do have, for example, commercial banks, which, we know those ones are really dealing with commercial financing. Then you have mutual banks. Mutual banks, the difference is that mutual banks are really owned by shareholders, and then you have cooperatives. Those are three different kinds of categories of banks. And with that, there are several provisions that are made by the Banks Act that require either a commercial bank to act in a particular way, mutual banks, and cooperatives. So when we look at Ithala Bank, it really has not been any of those. And the functions have been largely to reach out to the unbanked, and it's done a fantastic work. If you look at 1994 onwards, the reach to the unbanked has been phenomenal, reaching out to the rural areas and so on. But with the South African Reserve Bank, it has been looking at ways in which it allows Ithala Bank to grow into a full-fledged bank. And for that reason, those exemptions that you read about everywhere in the media were really opportunities and spaces for Ithala Bank to comply, to become a full-fledged bank. And unfortunately, that has not been the case, which is where now this particular case of provisional liquidation now arrives at. So
let's talk about why. What did they actually, the conditions, right? So what we're ultimately getting here is a failure to meet key conditions required to continue its operations. What were those key conditions then it needed to meet by the 15th of December 2023 in order then to continue its operations and then ultimately become perhaps a fully fledged bank at some later stage?
Right, so there are several of them, a range of them. So the exemption notice, it is not really just, it's really buying time, if you like, for Ithala Bank to meet the following several conditions. The one is there are governance issues. There are also capitalization issues. Let me talk to those briefly. When you talk to governance issues, the Prudential Authority, which was set up according to was set up in 2018, the objective was to make sure that banks are not reckless, they are not fully exposed to high risks, and therefore they're able to manage their finances in a way that does not jeopardize public or destroy market structures. So with the Ithala Bank, there were, for example, prolonged vacancies, that they were not filling in vacancies. And that was a governance issue that Prudential Authority raised consistently. You have also a high attrition rate of management where skilled or senior executives were coming in and going out at very rapid rate. What that does is that it creates institutional instability. You're not really able to make prolonged decisions. And that is one of the key issues. There was also an issue of succession planning that Prudential Authority found that they were not able to meet that as well. But then I think more critically, there are two key issues that relate. Those are the governance questions. They are now the financial questions. The one was that they did not comply with the directive to improve their technologies so that they try and contain money laundering. I think that was one of the key issues that prudential authorities raised. Yeah. And secondly, and very importantly, was their liquidity, and that would mean that they balance their books as they should, so they have more assets than liabilities. And those two financial issues are really some of the major risks that the bank exposed itself to because it did not comply by the time the final exemption ended in 2023.
257,000 depositors, they're now in trouble now and could face a very difficult situation for themselves, especially because the KZN government itself did not have anything with regards to the guarantees that should have been put in place as well, meaning that people could ultimately just be losing their money. How much risk of that is there? Does the major government then have to step in here? Will they?
So the South African Reserve Bank established an insurance fund, and this is partly, if you look at the history of collapsing or failure of banks in the country, the numbers are not looking good. I think from 1994 onwards, you're looking at potentially about 14 banks that have collapsed. Yeah. African Bank being one of the latest, Habib Overseas Bank, which is Pakistani-owned, also being one of the latest. And then, of course, VBS, 2018. Now we are talking of Ithala Bank. So what the South African Reserve Bank has done, because of the regularity of or the increasing numbers of banks that are collapsing for a range of reasons, they set up an insurance fund that secures deposits. And so depositors are still able to get money from that insurance fund. It's not a huge amount of money because, especially for the high-end depositors, but the insurance allows depositors, if a bank goes under, they're able to withdraw at least 100,000 from their deposits. But the bank, of course, ultimately, after liquidation, South African Reserve Bank will look into ways in which it can subsidize so that the deposits are paid out. Yeah. So there's not huge risk at the moment as far as the depositors are concerned. But there is what you call a run in deposits where people panic and they go and start withdrawing. And that's really what creates this ripple effect that you are seeing now.
Greater risk for the industry, is that limited?
So the South African banking system is very solid, and part of on a global level, the standards are South African banking system ranks very high. So there are not really major risks on the broader banking system, and Ithala Bank is not it's not one of the major banks, so there are no major risks in that regard. It is considered as a provincial state-owned entity, and by the way, one of the reasons why Prudential Authority has been pushing Ithala Bank to become a full-fledged bank is to become a nationally owned, state-owned enterprise. So there are no major risks at the moment, but I think the Reserve Bank is really being cautious, as it has always been, to manage the financial system. And I think that is very consistent with just how it's been very tight on managing financial regulations in the country.
Yeah, I want to ask, just as a broader question, just last year we were looking at the likes of SVB, which is of course a bank that failed as well in the United States. So that was a worry for some of the lower end banks. It didn't really touch the top scale or the major banks then in the United States, but there was fears that it could ripple through because of the lower interest rate cycle. And then you have all these banks that we're pointing towards, and now of course we're talking then about Ithala. What is the problem with the lower end banks not being able to perhaps stay up? Or why do we see so many, either it be liquidations or other issues happening with them?
So I think partly there are several parts that one could look at. Firstly, certainly in South Africa, Ithala Bank, as I said earlier, has been one of the most successful development finance institutions targeting the low-end income citizens. And it's done a phenomenal job in that. But I think what happens is the transition to ensure that, remember, initially what Ithala Bank did particularly, there was a heavy subsidy from the provincial government. Remember, it's owned by the KwaZulu-Natal provincial government. And over time, the idea of a bank when it starts off is, of course, to ultimately become self-sustainable and make sure that it balances its books. And I think it is that transition that there is a huge struggle. For most banks, I think around the world, European banks, American banks, they are much more riskier than South African banks. And the way they manage their regulations are perhaps a little bit more laissez-faire and more casual than South African banks would, for a range of reasons. But historically, the South African banking system remains very solid. But that being said, we have, as I've stated earlier, seen, of course, a number of banks that have collapsed. And this is because in the process of making those transitions, the management question becomes a major one, and governance of these banks. And as they continue to grow, this is where it's easier to manage a much smaller bank, but as it continues to grow, more risks are involved. There's a higher risk exposure, and that risk exposure management becomes a national problem, because if, for example, Ithala Bank goes under significant, there is no, depositors lose their money, it can have implications, particularly on share markets. Yeah. And the Reserve Bank wants to contain that before it happens. So all this to say, in a nutshell, or in summary, that the banks really struggle to make the transition from being a small bank to a bank that is growing, that there are higher risks. How do you manage that transition to managing potentially higher risks? That really has been the challenge. If you look at VPS, Africa Bank, Habib, and you look now at Ithala Bank, that really is the central question.
Yeah, and look, we're trying to create a more inclusive environment that includes far more people, of course, creating more successes then for the banked and the unbanked as well. That was the success of VBS, for example, as well, and unfortunately, that didn't come to fruition anymore.